Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. Um, Thank you, especially to our panelist and to Mark Anchin, who is moderating again for us this afternoon. I don't want to take too much time. I want to get right to our content. Just a quick note, I'm going to please ask that everyone do remain muted for the entirety of our time together today. If you have questions that you would like to pose to our panelists, please ask them in the chat feature. You can pose a question at any time, and that at a certain point, Mark will lead us through a Q&A. Our session is being recorded this afternoon, so if you would like to not be recorded, you can simply turn your camera off or change your name. And again, thank you for taking the time for being here with us today for this important conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Mark to get us going. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Goodman, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is sort of a continuation of our discussion from last Friday. I don't know about you, but the weeks just seem to be flying by, and it seems like yesterday we were doing this, but we're pleased to be with you again this week to discuss further what's happened in Israel, implications for ongoing activities in the future, and have conversation with you as well. We're very, I think, all somewhat at ease a bit, given the ceasefire that took hold earlier this morning in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, negotiated by Egypt and the United States. We'll hear more about that in a moment from John Allen and others. And let me just say that the bios of each of us are again still posted on the website. And today we have with us another member of our little discussion group that we've been going for several months now, Dylan Hanley, who's with us. Derek Pensler is not able to be with us this week, so Dylan's with us. And his bio is also on the website. So please, if you get a chance, look it up and you'll get a good idea of his background as well. We're going to start with Howard Edelman. We'll start with discussing sort of the challenges and understanding the conflict from different perspectives. One of the things that I think we're all sort of coming to grips with or trying to grow up with is we hear a lot of stuff. We're reading a lot of articles. We're seeing a lot of things going on, and we're hearing different points of view. And how do we reconcile those different perspectives and different points of view? And I bet we've asked Howard to try to deal with that, and also to talk and about the intercommunal violence that's occurred in the mixed towns and villages within Israel, which is a critical issue that Israel is going to have to face going forward. Following that, John Allen will talk to us about responses from various countries, particularly focusing, I think, on the United States administration, the Biden administration's response to all of this, but as well mentioning some of the other responses. Dylan will talk to us about the Canadian political response, how Canada's responded to this. What impact has this had on the Jewish community and on campuses, on campus activities, particularly with Jewish students dealing with outbursts of anti-Semitism and the like on campuses. David DeWitt will then take us into a discussion on, again, the international responses, actions, and looking sort of prospectively forward. What does all this mean for the future in terms of Israel's place in the international world? I will end with a few very short comments about coalition building, as I did last week. Not much has changed, but there are a few points to be made. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Howard and we'll begin our discussion. Howard, please.
Thank you. I'm going to open with a question to you all, which is who won? Because it's a way of getting in at the different perspectives. Because it must be paradoxical to an average person looking at the situation, and they see all the damage done in Gaza, the number of deaths, over 200, number of claimed child deaths, etc. And yet they're cheering victory and they're having victory parades. On the other hand, that isn't occurring in Israel. And if you talk to Israelis, they feel very sad and depressed a bit about what happened. They've had only a dozen deaths. And if you go through those deaths, 3 are foreign workers, 2 themselves the 16-year-old girl and her father were Arab Israelis. And if you look for a picture of the 5-year-old boy who was killed in an attack, who was in a safe room and a shrapnel went through the window, you can't find pictures of him, but you'll find lots of pictures of little children being dug up from the rubble in Gaza. And of course, the story goes that pictures are worth 1,000 words. And we have now communication through Instagram, etc. And people get their news in very abbreviated ways. And so it isn't only the sense of victory from Hamas, but there is a sense of a lot of support swung to Hamas, which is sworn to eliminate Israel. And you say, how can this be? Well, one of the things is if you go through the detailed causes, of which I'll pick a few, you find the story is told in a very limited way in the larger scene. And when you tell the details and you know the details, you get a very different picture. It doesn't matter whether it's the situation on Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the issue starts off with loudspeakers turned at their highest pitch, police asking the authorities to turn them down. They don't turn them down. The authorities cut off the wires and a riot ensues. That's a brief version of it, but you get that kind of sense, and that's different than the police invading the Al-Aqsa Mosque with stun grenades, etc., which they did, but without the context, it gives a different flavor. The same is true of the putting up the barriers in Damascus Plaza. Myself, I think it was a stupid decision, but it was a decision in anticipation that there might be troubles. And in fact, it created the troubles. And people responded to it with resentment and blew up about it. In the Sheikh Jarrah situation, where it's claimed to be and seen and reported as Israel trying to evict Palestinians, when you get into details, it's a civil suit between owners of the property who happen to be Jewish and owned the property before 1948, trying to get possession of the homes and of their lands, probably to put settlers in. The fact that the court offered a compromise that they could stay for the rest of the life of the main renter isn't reported. Instead, it's the court that's evicting them. And so you get this distorted tale. And that's true in almost everything I touch and analyze. If people want detailed analysis, they can always get my email and I'll send it to them. I want to end because I want to be brief and leave this open to questions and discussions. Because the most important element I think that's happened is the breakout in the violence between the Arab population in Israel and the Jewish population. And that's most troublesome. The extent of it is clearly unprecedented. And I'll tell you the story of Samir. Samir is a resident, medical resident at the Tel Shomar Hospital. He wrote a blurb which was to identify with the Palestinian cause. It was, I'd say, a semi-radical blurb of identification. He got attacked and criticized by a lot of his medical colleagues, both Arab and Jewish. And by the way, Samir is not his real name. I'm using a name, an artificial name. He got criticized strongly. There was no conversation that ensued, but it was a symptom that a lot of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, who are resentful of what their situation is. And you'd say, why? In the medical field, when 21% of the population is Arab, about 21% of the positions at all levels of the medical thing, it's specialists, doctors, nurses, technicians, on average are Arab. There's equality of opportunity in that field. And yet you have a degree of resentment against the situation. And the situation, when you get down to the bottom line of it, is the state does not represent them. The state often treats them as second-class citizens. The symbols of the state, the holidays of the state aren't part of their narrative. And so it becomes a conflict over narratives at the bottom line. And in the conflict over narratives, the simple emotional tale, which is the tale that's told by Hamas, tends to win over the detailed facts and analysis. We have to do the facts and analysis, that's our job. But in doing those facts and analysis, we also have to understand what the winning game is in terms of storytelling. I turn it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Howard. Let's move on to John Allen. John, talk to us a bit about responses from the various governments, particularly the US.
Thanks, Rabbi, and thanks, Mark. I'm going to focus, as Mark suggested, on the US piece and Joe Biden's role, and then just talk a bit about some of the other players. No matter how much Joe Biden had hoped he could ignore the Israeli-Palestinian quagmire while he focused on COVID, the economy, China, and Iran, the conflict, as it always does with US presidents, came back to bite him and once again sucked up much of the world's energy and media, of course. It was telling, for example, that the president visited a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan on Tuesday to highlight electric vehicle production, but refused a request to speak to a group of Arab Americans there. It's a region, by the way, that has one of the largest concentrations of Palestinian Americans in the nation. He couldn't, however, avoid Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who is a Palestinian American from Detroit and who confronted him at the tarmac to speak her mind about what she thought was the president's too timid involvement. We'll come back to Congress and the problems it's presented the president. So despite leading an administration that has made much of defending human rights worldwide and has not shied away from criticizing China, Russia, and Myanmar for their dismal human rights records, Biden was clearly reluctant to engage very early on in this conflict. Why? Well, the simple answer, as some have suggested, is that Biden understood that Bibi Netanyahu would not end the bombing quickly, and certainly not before Hamas was convinced to stop the rockets. So Biden and others, including Tony Blinken, his Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, his National Security Advisor, called the Israelis often, deploying so-called quiet diplomacy, but the president decided to wait to put pressure on Israel publicly and more forcefully. Another reason is that Biden's got a history with Bibi Netanyahu, and he knows well that Bibi doesn't always care much about what US presidents say these days, especially Democratic ones. You may recall, for example, that while Biden was on an official visit to Israel as vice president, Bibi embarrassed him and President Obama by announcing a slew of new settlements right after Obama had requested that there be no new settlements. Then, of course, Netanyahu violated all the rules of diplomatic protocol and came to Washington uninvited by Obama. He spoke to both houses of a Republican-controlled Congress in an effort to scuttle the JCPO nuclear deal with Iran. In fact, Bibi has effectively ignored all entreaties from US presidents, from George Bush, 43, through Obama, and even to some extent from Trump. You'll recall that it took the Abraham Accords to stop Bibi's annexation proposal, not Trump's displeasure about it. Moreover, and although we all in the West say that they are illegal, the settlements project has continued throughout Bibi's tenure without much protest from the US. And there have been no efforts on Israel's part, as we know, to restart the peace process, despite that being the West's general wish. And frankly, this will probably continue unless and until the US is prepared to up the ante a bit. Much has also been made of the fact that no US ambassador to Israel had been appointed, and not even an assistant secretary of state, the highest level in the State Department for the Middle East. Such delays at the beginning of US administration are not, however, unusual, and frankly, neither an ambassador nor an assistant secretary of state would have been any more successful than the president might have been at that point. Finally, Biden, as I said, was trying to manage the minefield that Congress and his party have become for him on this issue. Almost all Republicans continue to support Israel, come what may. The Democrats, however, are now more divided than ever between the pro-Israel camp and the Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib critics of Israel. From the White House's perspective, it's much easier to criticize China and Russia than to force Israel to, quote, stop defending itself. And of course, that goes for Canada in spades as well. And finally, before the Biden administration or any other can have any real influence over the root causes of this latest conflict and others that might appear in the future, new leadership, of course, is going to be required in both Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. The other major player here appears to have been Egypt, who was able to rein in Hamas finally and convince it that enough was enough and that the population of Gaza had suffered enough. Qatar, which funds Hamas to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, also likely played a role, as did the UN representative on the ground. At the UN, the US prevented 4 separate attempts by the United Nations Security Council to bring forth a resolution condemning the violence. There are rumors that the text of these resolutions did not mention Hamas's initial barrage of rockets. I tried to confirm that rumor, but was unable to. Had the council actually tried to pass a resolution, the US no doubt would have vetoed it, and that would have been embarrassing for all. As far as Canada's role, I can say that the foreign minister and Bob Rae at the UN both made statements that were more balanced and somewhat more critical of Israel's role than I have seen previously. I don't know whether that's a change in position or just a reflection of this particular conflict. I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Lots to discuss when we get into Q&A. Let me now turn it over to Dylan for more on the Canadian political response, Jewish community response, and what's happening on campuses. Dylan, please.
Thanks, Mark. I'll just tell you 2 sentences about myself because I'm far less eminent than the other folks on the panel. I'm a lobbyist in Ottawa. My day job has nothing to do with Israel. I work for the presidents of the 15 large research universities and have for about the last 5 years. But before that, I worked for CIJA, doing government relations and university relations, dealing with some of the situations on campus. And I remain active with CIJA and CJPAC and with these issues in general, and have provided some advice to both the Liberal government side and, to a certain extent, Erin O'Toole's office through the current situation, or at least my opinion when asked. I'll start a bit on the Canadian Jewish community side from my own observations. And I think, you know, what I've observed in terms of the way that this crisis landed in the Canadian Jewish community is sort of the same way that it's landed in the political milieu and in Canadian society in general, which is a little differently than previous conflicts have. I think the events in Jerusalem preceding the conflict that Howard made reference to, complex as they may be, are difficult to explain and even more difficult to justify to somebody, especially when they've seen, you know, video of the things that took place in Al-Aqsa during the police raids. And I think that's compounded with, a bit of what John talked about with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other Democratic leaders of the camp that's quite critical of Israel, but also just a shift in the demographics of the Democratic support base in the United States, and that has echoes here in Canada. And so you've seen a huge, overwhelming prevalence of critical messages against Israel in social media, and then the last thing I think is the tendency towards increasing polarization in politics, both in Canada and in Israel, and the increasing identification of Israel as a right-wing issue, and probably exacerbated by the strong association of Netanyahu with the previous Trump administration. I think in terms of the Canadian political scene, I talked to both the Prime Minister's office and Aaron O'Toole's office yesterday about this, just to ask them if there's anything that had changed. Well, before I get to that, just a little bit on the social media piece, the Twitter, the Instagram, et cetera, that's going on. It's difficult for people to see what's going on out there because these platforms are designed to create echo chambers where you see things that reinforce the things that you're interested in. And so, but a lot of the university students and young people, young liberal-minded progressives in general, have seen messages which are very, very critical of Israel. And I think the difference from previous conflicts is a lot of previously unaffiliated people have been brought into this one. You've seen a lot of celebrities sharing very extreme memes, which are graphics with a message, and videos accusing Israel of genocide and ethnic cleansing. My wife, who's not Jewish, and nor am I actually, is a teacher here, and she's been horrified watching tweets from the head of the anti-racism unit at the school board here, who's a teacher, tweeting, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, things like that. Our own niece tweeting out a meme that says, what's happening in Israel isn't complicated, it's ethnic cleansing. And of course, when we called her, she said, well, I don't know anything about it. I just tweeted it because other people, or I posted it on Instagram because other people were doing it. We didn't want to offend anybody, and she took it down. But there's a lot of that happening, and it's a really significant challenge, I think, for Israel and the Jewish community. On the political side, there's been a lot more pressure within caucuses to change positions that have held for about the last 15 or almost 20 years, starting under the Paul Martin government, where the Canadian government started voting with Israel and against anti-Israel resolutions at the United Nations, and had sort of a reflexive position that was supportive of Israel. And you've started to see, I'm sure many of you are aware, the Trudeau government has broken some of that pattern of voting with Israel at the United Nations. They still do vote with Israel on most of these anti-Israel resolutions, but they've broken on one, which has to do with recognizing a Palestinian state. But in this conflict specifically, you've seen the NDP move to a very strong position, a very strong pro-Palestinian position, calling for a ban of weapons exports to Israel. And I think part of this is just politics for them, as they've seen a threat from the New Democratic Party, which is led by a Jewish woman named Annamie Paul, coming out with a much more tempered response. And I think the NDP have figured they can scoop up a lot of the anti-Israel vote in the Green Party by taking those positions. But the Liberal Party has been the most marked and interesting to observe it, and maybe worrisome to observe as well. You've seen a new divide in the Liberal Party, and my understanding is there's been huge pressure on the Prime Minister from within his caucus to come out and be a stronger voice against Israel in terms of what was going on in Gaza and in Jerusalem. Some of this from MPs within the Muslim community, but some of it from MPs that, frankly, we would have considered allies of the Jewish community just a couple of years ago. And you've seen from the center, from the Prime Minister's office, less of an effort to rein in and control some of those messages. You've seen open letters going out to constituents. And yesterday, an open letter published by 26 members of parliament, the majority of whom were liberal, that are some of the members of the parliamentary friendship group with the Palestinian people, but again, not people that I would have imagined this coming from. A very strong statement condemning Israel and calling on the prime minister. I mean, some of the language from it, it's no longer adequate for Canada to ignore the multiple violations of Palestinian human rights by the Israeli government. Canada must go beyond statements of concern and work with the international community to condemn forced evictions, settlement building, unequal treatment, attacks on journalists, and the bombing of humanitarian and medical facilities. It's critical that the government condemn the occupation and the illegal settlements, and so on. So this is a pretty marked change in terms of what's being allowed, even though, you know, from the actual official government position, it's been measured, although less supportive of Israel than it might have been in the past. And again, my understanding is there's a lot of pressure inside the caucus on that. The Conservatives have still hewn to a very strong pro-Israel line, although I can tell you from some conversations that I had before the Gaza violence got amplified to the level that it did, there were a lot of people that were quite uncomfortable there also in terms of what had gone on in Jerusalem. And all of that, again, I think is a reflection of what's going on in society as a whole. And the last piece that I was asked to talk about is the campus piece. I think the expectation would be there will be more pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli activity on campuses this year than there have been in a number of years past. It's gotten sort of quiet or quieter in the last number of years. We've had a number of notable incidents in the last couple of weeks. There was the student newspaper at Queen's University that published a very one-sided op-ed and pledged to donate money from the newspaper, which was student money, to a charity that would funnel the money over to Gaza, which they weren't allowed to do under Ontario law, and they had to walk it back. You had a big call for BDS to be accepted at McGill, and I will say the administration at McGill pushed back very strongly against it and actually said that to do so would be racist and would contravene the equity and diversity policies of the university, which was, you know, encouraging to see. And also the Wilfrid Laurier student video with students recording themselves talking about stabbing Jews on campus. So I think that there's going to be fertile ground for the anti-Israel movements to recruit folks in the coming year. And it is going to be a challenge for Jewish communal organizations, for Hillels. And I don't think the genie will be put back in the bottle just because of the ceasefire. It'll be interesting to see on the political sphere, you know, whether we continue towards a dichotomy between the Conservatives hewing to a pro-Israel line and the others, you know, moving a little bit more against it, or whether that's able to be sort of contained and put back together.
Dylan, thank you so much. Let me now turn it over to David for international responses and reflections on where we go from here. David, please.
Thanks, Mark. I think I'm going to do offer some comments less on the responses, but more trying to give some sense of what's out there, what has been out there, and what we might be considering for the future, what Israel will have to consider, and how we need to understand it. You know, it's long been said that nothing is permanent but change. And yet when you look at the Middle East, you have two following observations I'd start off with. One, since 1948, Israel's perspective has been the creation of a nation state. That hasn't changed. The Arab perspective has been Israel, a settler colonial movement, and that hasn't changed. But there have been many things that have occurred in the construct of the years since 48 till today. Israelis and Israeli supporters have continued to view the situation relatively static, with the occasional disruption, such as the Iranian Revolution, 9/11, and the Arab uprisings. These had impacts in the region, but I'd argue only marginally for Israel, with the possible exception of Iranian and Arab nuclear aspirations and the confirmed vulnerability of Arab states to their own Islamic extremists. And these events strengthened the dominance of states and authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East. Change, often dramatic, was ongoing. The Americans introduced boots on the ground throughout the region and strengthened its dominance in terms of military bases from Asia through the Mediterranean. Russia re-entered the region, and China's emergence as a superpower led it into the region. However, for Israel, the strengthening of its own Jewish ethno-nationalism and deepening shift to the identity politics simply consolidate the perception, and for many, the reality, of Israel as an occupier, slipping from the envisioned liberal democratic state for all its citizens to the land of the Jews, given further credence by its encroachments into the West Bank. With strong US support and acquiescence from Europe, and then support from China and from Russia, Israel has continued to presume that military superiority, scientific achievements, and a robust economy that will sustain its overall security. The issue of its future with Palestinians has been marginalized and more recently deployed for domestic political purposes. Today, the irony of ethno-nationalism in a post-colonial world that is increasingly illiberal, if not authoritarian, defined by ethnicity and religion, where the larger Arab and Muslim worlds pursue their identity politics and state consolidation, often affected by extremist ideologies and actors. You can even see this in Europe or in Trump's US to some extent. The conversation is now seen through two lenses. On the one hand, challenging what is seen as the detritus of colonialism, the settler-occupier aided by forces of globalization, which reinforces power differentials. That's on the one hand, and that's the way much of the world sees Israel. On the other hand, simultaneously with the goal to define and control state borders and the reification of the state. So these same states that look at Israel this way are currently actively engaged in both challenging, but trying to use globalization to enhance the sanctity, the rigidification of their own borders and their own state regime. This puts Israel squarely in the target of social movements and populist governments in both the West and in the global South. Resolving, or at least more honestly addressing this reality, will be a fundamental requirement if there is to be a break in the cycle of violence. Confidence and security building measures are required, but that presumes an ability to confront the opposing ideologies and constructs. And to be effective policy, it requires coordination and collaboration among all those seeking to achieve confidence and security in their futures. Israel requires confidence that Arab states and their peoples can and will accept the Israeli state as a legitimate actor in the region. That hasn't changed. But what has changed is we see some efforts. Abraham Accords, the treaties with Jordan and with Egypt as starters. But Palestinians require a clearer sense of an optimistic future, free from further Israeli encroachments, along with avenues to share in progress and prosperity. And while that has been the desire and the language, we haven't seen much movement on that. That said, I believe that for the near future, a status quo, an irredentist, or even an expansionist Israel is sufficiently strong across most sectors to manage the opprobrium that the constraints and the constraints it would face. However, it also means increased public isolation and likely lost opportunity for its own development and security in the international community. The current Iraqi brokered talks between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran are but one indication that the Middle East and how countries will line up in the Middle East is changing. Nuclear discussions now have branched out to issues of ballistic missiles, chemical and biological weapons, inspection regimes, and on the sidelines, some thinking about how to connect or to construct regional security regimes, since a region-wide agreement on the prohibition of nuclear weapons or other weapons is unlikely. Failed states, including Lebanon, that has become a Hezbollah-Iran satellite, pose a serious challenge to Israel and to the region. Can Israel afford not to engage these new emerging realities? So finally, a few quick comments about thinking about tomorrow. States do remain the principal organizations with predominance of coercive power. However, the Middle East shows the disruptive effect of weaponized, and I include cyber capable non-state actors, which is a serious problem for all states in the region. The United States is likely to pursue selective withdrawal of military commitments, although I would expect them to retain major bases, providing ongoing significant naval and special forces capabilities to coordinate with Israel as its principal military ally and intelligence ally, but to be allocated with much greater restraint. They will remain in order to bolster allies, to constrain competitors, and we should never forget to pursue primarily US national interests, and those change. The United States is likely to consider so-called soft power, things like economic, commercial, and humanitarian commitments, as their preferred instruments of diplomacy, attempting to stabilize and to create greater parallelisms between US national interests and Arab state interests. Hard power will be just over the horizon. That's probably good for Israel, but it will come at a cost. US and the European Union continue to be the preferred partners for Arab states and for Iran, preferred over China or Russia. That's an opportunity. Russia has limited interests in the region, just its southern periphery, and it has limited capacity. And China is pragmatic and sees the Middle East as part of its Belt Road Initiative, just as it has strong ties with Israel and wishes to deepen those. However, China is not eager in getting drawn into much beyond commercial interest and diplomatic influence that will help it with the global South and give it access to Europe and the United States. The Middle East is a land bridge for China. And in that way, Israel is an ally. Between China's westward and its eastward undertakings, China's strategic goal includes making it the link and gatekeeper between East and West. Israel's interests reside with strengthening such initiatives as the Abraham Accords, deepening people-to-people diplomacy within economic, commercial, technological, and educational sectors. So that leaves the question, can Israel pursue those interests without simultaneously addressing in a principled and effective manner its relationship with Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and fundamentally within its own citizenry? I just received a note from Gabby Ben-Dor, who many of you know because of his annual lectures. I want to quote, and with this I'll end, a brief statement he made. Gabby writes, "There are also some encouraging trends in Western Europe. Many people there have begun to realize that under the slogans of Palestinian rights and liberation, there lurks the danger of Islamic radicalism, which will eventually lead to rockets being fired at Paris, Berlin, and London. These people support Israel for that very reason. Unfortunately, the people you and me used to feel comfortable with, left of center intellectuals and activists, by and large are on the other side. And this process has been going on for years. It is hard to take, but the facts are clear. The liberal left has branded Israel as part of the imperialist West, and which has to be condemned and opposed. And increasingly, it will be opposed vigorously." Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, David, for that sort of great overview of that. I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please post them in the chat. We'll be getting to that shortly. Questions or comments, if you wish. I want to, before I just make a few points, recommend an article that appeared in the New York Times yesterday by Dalia Scheindlin, who's a pollster and a political analyst in Israel, does a lot of very important work. And she wrote a very interesting article in yesterday's New York Times about the impact of the recent conflict on the political situation in Israel, and how the political situation can't ignore what's going on as a result of this conflict and all of the issues that led up to it as well. I recommend that highly to you. It's a short article and well worth reading. Not much has really changed since last week when we met with regard to coalition negotiations and discussions. So it's been actually fairly quiet. The one thing we can say, however, that even since the ceasefire took hold earlier this morning, just about all the leaders of the Israeli political parties have come out and made comment about the ceasefire. And with the exception of, from what I've read anyway, with the exception of Tamar Zandberg, the leader of Meretz, all the other leaders had some criticisms of Netanyahu and of the cabinet in approving the ceasefire unconditionally. And many of them were concerned that a number of conditions weren't imposed on Hamas as part of the agreement to enter into a ceasefire, including, most importantly, the return of Israeli soldiers who have bodies of Israeli soldiers and others who have been held hostage in Gaza for many years. Even the religious Zionists who have indicated that they would be part of a Netanyahu government warned Netanyahu that if there was any conditions put into the ceasefire with regard to issues surrounding the Temple Mount and related issues to that, that they would seriously reconsider entering into a coalition government with him. Not how serious that is, it's anybody's guess. I think there's a lot of posturing going on among the various political parties and the leaders. Yair Lapid has until June 2nd, which is, I believe, a week Wednesday, in order to form a coalition government. And as I indicated last week, failing that, President Rivlin will either turn to another leader of one of the parties, unlikely, or return the mandate to the Knesset, which, given the current composition of the Knesset, could end in a stalemate, and we could very well be looking at a fifth election. More on that soon. And by the way, we should also indicate that President Rivlin's term of office is coming to an end next month, and the Knesset is about to vote on who the next president of Israel will be. And right now, the leading candidate seems to be, it's Isaac Herzog, Bougie Herzog, who used to be the former leader of the Labor Party and is currently the chair of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel. So there's a lot to watch over the next 10 to 12 days, and even beyond that into June. With that, I think we will have a bit of a discussion among the five of us, and then we will turn over to questions from the rest of you. So let me start with any comments among any of you from what you've heard from our colleagues. Anybody want to jump in and say anything that stood out?
I'll jump in. What just listening to everybody, there's a consensus among us and a lot of observers like us. And that's unusual in a way. It's a consensus of what David summarized as on the power side, the economic side, Israel is going to be very strong, etc. On the narrative side, on the emotional side, on the appeal to progressives everywhere, Israel's in a weak position. That's my impression of what everybody said. I don't know whether you agree or not.
Maybe I'll just jump in to echo what David said at the end. Israel was in this kind of unusual position where its statehood, 1948, came just before decolonization of the rest of the world. So while Israel, seen as a state of the West for all the important and necessary reasons that we know, was coming into its own when Africa and Asia and these other regions were decolonizing. And of course, we also had the situation in South Africa with the end of apartheid. So I agree fully with what you had to say, David, and Israel was put in this kind of unfortunate situation. And unfortunately, its policies have tended to reinforce some of the perceptions, while, as you say, David, the liberal left has moved farther and farther into this anti-colonial perspective. So Israel is getting caught up in that, and they're also, of course, as Howard said, they're getting caught up because whether it's the U.S. Congress or the UK political parties, people are having a hard time defending some of Israel's policies. So it's.
Thank you. Dylan, please.
To say, on that same vein, when you look at what's going on in the United States, I think the other piece to be a bit concerned about is the potential destabilizing effect of Hezbollah, Hamas, and other regional actors viewing America as wavering on this may have on their boldness to act and destabilize things and take away some of the deterrence that's there. And I mean, I think that's a real possibility, unintended as it might be, of some of the criticism that's come from the US.
Howard, did you want to say something else?
No, I think Dylan just made an excellent point.
Good. David?
You just wonder whether, if there was a change of leadership and there were some steps, confidence building, trust building, whether Israel could begin to change the nature of the criticism, how much it would take. I mean, obviously, it started out as Israel the David and the Arab states the Goliath. 67, we get a turnaround and Israel starts to become the Goliath and the Palestinians the David. What would it take for Israel to do to begin to change its image in the world? I don't know.
I think, if I may, one of the issues connecting what you said, John, and Howard, but to Dylan's really important observation, is if the goal is to create peace and security for the state of Israel and opportunity and prosperity and peace and security for Palestinians, then the relaxation of certain kinds of guarantees by the West creates space with good leadership for the possibility of creating these new confidence and security building measures and moving incrementally towards achieving those goals. But certainly, I've now had a couple of conversations, not only with Gabi in Israel, but Mark Heller and Asher Susser, who are also known to the Holy Blossom community. And they all, are pondering what ultimately is the goal. That the leadership is not clearly articulating a goal that creates space for the pursuit of Israeli interests, but also the pursuit of the Palestinian concerns at the same time. And is it simply unreachable? And therefore, if it's unreachable, we favor the securitization of Israel at whatever cost. So, Dylan,
So before I go to you, Dylan, let's talk about leadership. I think there's a strong consensus that in order to move the needle in regard to Israel's approach, relationship to the issues, a new form of leadership needs to take place in Israel. And we know that at this point, the Israel electorate is quite divided among the various political parties. And we can see that after 4 elections, still no party is able to emerge to form a strong coalition government. And I think, correct, I stand to be correct, but I think most of the people with us today, and certainly among the group of us, would probably say that a new leadership would be most welcome of a center-left type of government, which could then hopefully make the kind of changes that David, John, and even Dylan have referenced. What's the possibility of that happening in the near term in Israel, given that the movement of people on the ideological continuum is very small? There are very few Israelis who actually move between parties in terms of their voting behavior. What would it take? What needs to be done in order to change the minds and hearts of some Israelis to move more to the center-left in terms of their voting behavior. Any thoughts?
I think it's on the way, Mark. It's on the way through the Arab parties of Israel. The idea that the Jewish parties have finally accepted that they, in order to rule, need to have the Arab parties having their support and perhaps their participation is really novel. And that'll make a big difference.
Good, thank you. Dylan, I thought you wanted to make a comment as well.
Look, I mean, I think that part of this isn't just a reflection of the specific leaders, although, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of Netanyahu, but I think also of the frustration on the Israeli side at not seeing any really viable solutions. And I'm not sure that excuses sort of taking actions and policies, but I think those have been allowed because of, you know, the big center in Israeli politics has just become skeptical of peace negotiations. And I think most of them kind of moved on. And I think sometimes you look at big tectonic shifts. We looked at the Arab Spring, and I think we may have seen potentially another one with the Abraham Accords and the normalization of Israel within the Middle East. We'll see what this does to that. And I think it's possible that that actually could push Israel into a more dovish position, because if Hamas is isolated and some of the facts on the ground are recognized by the rest of the Middle East, I think that takes away the most fundamental insecurity of the Israelis, which is no recognition of any Jewish state on any of that land. And once they have that from more states, I mean, if they got a Saudi Arabia to the table, that would be a big deal. I don't know if the Biden administration is going to do that. And I certainly don't think, I think that's going to require somebody different at the prime minister's chair than Netanyahu now, especially.
Well, I mean, I think when we talk about leadership, we mean leadership. And leadership means bringing a population with you. Instead of fear-mongering, instead of Iran's going to get the nuclear weapon tomorrow, for the last 12 years, it's been tomorrow, he's gone to the UN. Instead of telling Israelis there is no partner for peace while he deals with Hamas on the side, you get somebody who really begins to try to convince Israelis that there could be a partner for peace, but we're going to have to do something and they're going to have to do something. So you lead them. Right now, there is no leadership in that direction. The only other thing I'll say, and I don't know, you would be better placed, David, but it's interesting to note that as the Americans have left the Saudis on their own a bit and send a signal that they're no longer going to provide the kind of support, fascinating how they started to talk to the Iranians. And you just wonder whether if the Americans say, look, you guys, you know, sort out your problem. We'll come and help you. But it's time that you own this issue and it's time you dealt with it. And don't keep relying on us to back you up every time something comes to the Security Council or whatever. You know, grow up and grab the issue and do something with it.
Absolutely. In fact, there have been reports of exploratory conversations among the Gulf Cooperation Council of thinking about what would a sub-regional security arrangement look like that would include Iran and Iraq and the GCC. And having that focused on being responsible for their mutual security, knowing that relying on external actors is not only not wise in the long run, it's increasingly not affordable financially if they're going to rely on weapons to define their security, their mutual security. It has to be done through diplomatic means. If those conversations continue, that could be a major breakthrough. And it doesn't directly address the issue of Israel-Palestine, but the extent to which Israel might well be on the periphery of those talks because they are part of the Abraham Accords, because they do have peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, suggests that it could create space for some confidence in further looking at options in which the Palestinians gain some sense of pride and stability and opportunity. But that's well down the road. And as you've all said, it really requires new leadership.
I mean, just there aren't any questions, so we're sort of coming to the end. But in terms of the leadership, among the current group of political leaders that are in Israel right now, anybody come to mind who could fill the role of and fill the mandate that we've all sort of created for this leader of Israel?
Well, you can only go by who's available. And
I'm saying,
clearly the next bet is Lapid. If you don't take Netanyahu, and we don't know how well he would do.
Who might be drafted?
any thoughts? Nobody has any other names they want to throw
I'm
in?
not close enough to that community.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any?
I have a question, actually.
Oh, Paula, please go ahead.
So Bennett, when I'm listening to this thing, Bennett wants to be prime minister. He is decided to leave the negotiations because of what's happened. Would that be a carrot in terms of Lapid's negotiations, in terms of trying to create a new government?
Well, if I may, Paula, that was part of the negotiation with Bennett before the conflict arose, which was that Bennett would be the first, would take the first spot as prime minister in that coalition government. So that was already agreed to by Lapid. And then Bennett's now walked away from it, as you've indicated.
But now things have happened. So the question is, after what's happened, given another week, could that change?
It could very well change. Bennett himself was critical of the ceasefire for some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. So, and as I said, it's a moving target. We'll see what happens in the next, 10 to 12 days. But it's a good point. Yeah.
Although from what I've been reading, Bennett has been criticized pretty heavily by his own supporters for not seeming to know what he wants to do, even though he's been offered the prime ministership by both the right and the left.
That's very true.
So, but it's that now that's his own people, of course, and we're talking about six MKs in total, which of course is.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it doesn't address Howard's observation about how the potential of Arab political parties in Israel could be a breakthrough and could shift some of the conversation and the agenda, because that's something that Bennett has clearly said he will not participate in. So that's.
But given the intercommunal violence, has that part of the equation changed, at least in the short term?
But of course, because of the intercommunal violence, all the more need to have an Arab political party as part of the coalition.
Yes, well, that's, if you can get there, that's very, very progressive.
Yeah, but that's where creative liberal democratic politics would show its strength. And you need a strong leader to pursue that. Because otherwise, if you don't have a legitimate Arab voice in addressing the situation in Lod or Haifa or any other communities, the idea of how to build back. I mean, one of the things that struck me in Gavi's note, but also in Mark Heller's and Asha's earlier, were their fear that this issue, the shadow of the intercommunal violence, is going to be the hardest thing to address to move Israel forward and create opportunities. And
I agree with that.
An articulation of a goal, strategic goal by political leaders, it's adrift.
No, it is the hardest, but it's also the one that has the best yield to concentrate your attention on. And there also is all kinds of forces helping you to do it now. the dilemma is all kinds of weaknesses too. The inattention to the Arab neighborhoods where the hooligans have ruled in a number of them. The Hamas knowing now how to exploit that and lead it into protests. The fact that Jews say, how come they burned down 10 synagogues or set them on fire? And there's hardly any attention paid to that. And yet, we respond sometimes badly, but enormous attention to that. If you want asymmetry, there's asymmetry from the other way. So it's very complicated and hard, but it has the best kind of payoff.
There's just been two comments. Shelley Birnbaum was asking what North Americans can do. And Shelley, I would like to suggest that that's probably the subject of it, just a standalone webinar in terms of activities and engagement. And maybe we can think about doing that at Holy Blossom as well. And Elliot Jacobson raises an interesting point about leaders coming forward and taking the bull by the horns and really doing what we would think would be the moral and ethical thing to do, and relating it to the experience of some leaders like Sadat and King Abdullah I and others, and Rabin for that matter, Yitzhak Rabin, who lost their lives to what was, efforts at making peace. Any thoughts about that? And then we're going to bring it to an end.
Well, I think to Shelley's point, there's any number of people-to-people organizations which are working on the ground, grassroots, trying to bring Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis together, or Palestinians and Israelis together. And if you're despairing and you want to do something, then join New Israel Fund, Project Rosanna, Heart to Heart, give some money, get involved, and help Israelis and Arabs come together again, because God willing, we know that it's important right now.
Can I tell a little story? I was on the phone with my granddaughter in Jerusalem. She teaches, she's a teacher, and she vowed as a result of this to learn Arabic, and she's joining a Jewish Palestinian from East Jerusalem Association to advance Arab-Jewish dialogue. So, and she wasn't much involved in politics, but she's determined to begin to be involved.
Mark, can I ask Dylan to take 1 minute to comment on his views of what next in Canadian politics on this?
Dylan, do you want to tackle that?
Listen, I mean, I think one thing, in terms of Shelley's question about what North Americans can do, I think if your persuasion is something other than conservative, don't give up on your political party because they've done a few things that are critical of Israel, because the last thing that we need is a divide along party lines that's really vociferous in Canada on this issue. And we need thoughtful conversations in all of the political parties around it. I think in Canadian politics, it'll settle down over time. I think that the Trudeau government's a bit guilty of blowing in the wind and not having much of a strategy, not only on this issue, but on a lot of different issues, and it gets them into some trouble. I don't think they have deep thinkers in the Prime Minister's office on this issue. I mean, they had Roland Paris in the early days. They don't any longer. And so it's tough. I mean, you looked at statements they put out during the Gaza conflict, the Gaza border, protests, riots, whatever, a few years ago. I mean, I talked to them afterwards, and it sort of seemed like, they're doing their best, but I'm not sure there is a deep-seated strategic piece there. And I think the Conservatives will keep on plowing along, and those battles will happen in the ridings that a lot of the congregants here are sitting in York Centre, in Eglinton Lawrence, and Thornhill to a lesser extent, and in the Vaughan ridings. And so it's going to be important to the next election, and everyone knows that.
Okay, thank you. Let me thank all of you for being with us today. I wanted to wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and I'm not going to turn it over now to Les Rothschild from our Israel Engagement Committee to close today's session. Les?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Howard, John, Dylan, David, I think this has, again, been a forum for us to listen, to hear to some really good advice. I was going to say at the beginning that we started off obviously thinking that with the ceasefire, that's a positive sign. As the hour went on, I didn't hear a lot of good news, except until we got to Howard's granddaughter. So I think if that holds and there are more people like her, I think that may be some of the future. So let's hope for that. But otherwise, we got, I think, from what all of you said, we certainly have a long way to go in all the things that you've talked about. So thank you very much. We are the Israel Engagement Committee is putting up articles. They'll be on the Holy Blossom email today and also on our website. Articles that are trying to provide you with some information, some general information about what's going on. Some things coming out of URJ and some other people. We are looking for articles as well. So please take a look at that and stay tuned. We'll keep trying to keep you informed and stimulate your thoughts a little bit. So again, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.